The internet is already aware that not all content creators are good people. But what if I told you that one streamer was so desperate for money and fame that he would kill his girlfriend for the whole world to witness? When Valya fell in love with her supposed boyfriend Stas Reeflay, she believed it was the beginning of a new and comfortable world. But sadly, he did not reciprocate her feelings, and all of this would end in her losing her life for the sake of a mere $1,000. But who is Stas Reeflay? Who is Valya? What kind of sick internet phenomena allowed him to find an audience in the first place? And how has this story changed Russia's digital landscape? Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the vile world of trash streaming and how far one person would go for money and fame. The details behind this story are sad, the main character is absolutely infuriating, and all of this will leave you wondering how on earth this could have happened in the first place. Before we get into it, and just to let you know that I post stories like this up to twice a week here, so if that does sound like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. Oh, and also, if you want some really good coffee and would like something dark, rich and powerful, I've got a fresh batch over at classifiedcoffeeco.com. And now that we have all of that out the way, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Stas Reeflay. Privyet, folks, and welcome to Russia. Now, we've covered a few cases from this rather fascinating country before, and today we're adding another one to the list. With just over 144 million people calling this country home, Russia has a huge population. However, interestingly enough, it is not even half of the United States' 333 million residents. In contrast, it is almost double in size by landmass, making Russia a much more expansive country. To add to this rather isolated lifestyle, it can also experience harsher weather patterns and even harsher living conditions in general. But let's not go there in today's current climate. I don't really want to piss YouTube off. Anyway, our story today takes us to the country's capital, Moscow. Despite its very dense population, the crime rate is actually relatively low here. Now, that is likely because Moscow boasts more than 170,000 surveillance cameras installed across the city, all of which are equipped with a facial recognition system that can identify a person's face, gender, age, and identity in an instant. These cameras are known to cover more than 95% of all apartment buildings and public areas in the city. So, privacy violations aside, their surveillance system significantly reduces burglary and theft across Moscow, amongst other petty crimes. However, as many of you will know, the worst crimes often occur behind closed doors and in the comfort of our own homes. And sadly, our case today is no different. In the north of Moscow, and in a rather unassuming apartment complex, lived a young couple consisting of 30-year-old Stanislav Reshetnyak and his live-in girlfriend, 28-year-old Valentina Grigorieva, who, moving forward in this video, went by the name of Valya for short. Now, very little is known about the couple's past, but it is known that Stanislav lived with his grandmother until he was 9 years old, and was described as a quiet and awkward young boy. Moving into his late teenage years, he eventually graduated from high school and then went on to university. But sadly, a lack of motivation got the better of him, and so he dropped out in his first year. Without any motivation to do anything else, he would eventually join the military instead, where he worked as a computer repair specialist. And soon enough, that is when he met his girlfriend, Valya, when he was 29 years old. On the other hand, Valya grew up outside of Moscow in a small village, and was described as bubbly, kind, and caring as a child. However, as she grew older, she leaned into that untapped wild side, and found great pleasure in partying and clubbing across the nearby towns and villages. In order to fund this new lifestyle, she eventually resorted to escorting, posting ads online to find new clients. Shortly after beginning this newfound career, she then moved to Moscow in the year 2020, where she continued her life of partying, sex, and alcohol. And that is where she met Stanislav. After meeting in the summer of 2020, the pair decided to move in together by Christmas that year. How sweet. And so, their lives intertwined in Stanislav's small rented apartment. However, how he was paying for that apartment feeds into the controversial topic of this video. You see, Stanislav was not commonly known by his real name, Instead, he'd adopted the online nickname of Stas Reeflay, and so, for all intents and purposes, from now on we will refer to him as Stas. The internet can be both a blessing and, of course, a curse. It has given us many different routes into various entertainment industries, and one of the most popular forms of entertainment is streaming. Streaming allows people to watch and interact with their host who can be doing pretty much anything. Now, the most common type of streaming is while gaming, but there are plenty of other things you can do with your airtime, including crafting, artwork, and parties. And I think we all experienced that very weird NPC trend which happened only a few months ago. Now, most of these streamers will depend on donations from their viewers for income, so there is a never-ending incentive to appease them, and this often results in hosts either reacting to donations or following specific requests. And this was precisely how Stas supported himself and his partner. Although his content started as relatively normal gaming videos in the early 2010s, he grew greedy and quickly succumbed to more lucrative requests from his viewers. As a result, his streams changed quite drastically over time. People were no longer interested in his gaming, and quite frankly, that's because he was pretty shit. They wanted to see him do outrageous things on camera instead. Stas followed the money, and so his face and his stupid ideas eventually replaced his gaming. Most of his streams were rarely of him alone, and he would often invite his friends over to have that two-way dialogue in his videos. During this time, they would chat, drink alcohol, and take donations to do various things to each other. Most of those things often being idiotic, and sometimes even cruel. Before meeting Valya, one of his so-called friends would often bear the brunt of this abuse, but it didn't seem like he was ever in on the fun. Instead, it seemed like he was being targeted for the sole purpose of it. You see, Valentin Ganichev was not just mentally impaired, but also a homeless drifter, one who relied on others for food, water, and shelter for safety. And with him also being a chronic alcoholic, Stanislav or Stas could lean into this weakness and abuse it. And so, sadly, Valentin would appear on Stas's streams throughout the year of 2020, where he was subjected to neglect by numerous people. This included him being beaten, restrained, and forced to eat various foods, among other things that you definitely don't want to know about. Now, all of this was done in the name of money for food and alcohol, and despite the very degrading things that he was forced to do, he made barely anything from it. In many of these cases, Stas would abuse his friends for less than $1, and they were forced to do a multitude of things for him to make a decent income. Now, Valentin always insisted that he consented to the abusive behavior. But I mean, he was homeless, needed food and a roof over his head, and depended on alcohol. So of course, he was going to say that everything was okay. The poor guy had been exposed to various stints throughout many of these live streams. For example, in one instance, he was buried alive on stream while he could be heard crying and begging them to stop. So, you may be wondering who would watch these streams in the first place, and furthermore, how would people be making an income from them? Well, you may be surprised to learn that these streams belong to a whole genre of their own and are very popular in Russia. Roughly translated into English, trash streamers are people who livestream themselves doing anything that their audience wants in exchange for donations. And more often than not, these requests are violent, grotesque, and even abusive. And so, in short, Stas transitioned from a rather simple gaming streamer to one of these trash streamers throughout 2019. This is also no surprise, but due to the nature of his content, he was eventually banned from Twitch and would then turn to YouTube to continue his content. Now, believe me here, but I know more than most do about how careful you have to be with what you post on this platform. However, live streams seem to be moderated quite differently here, and so Stas seemed to slip through YouTube's guidelines and awareness for quite some time. Donations made during this time frame were enough to allow Stas to leave his job as a computer specialist in the year 2020, and as we know, that is when he met Valya. Now, you can probably see where this is going already, but after moving in with Stas, Valya would often join in on these live streams, and together they would often kiss, hug and chat with their audience. However, while Valya very clearly saw this as a relationship, Stas did not seem to reciprocate those feelings, and was rather coy with the nature of their relationship. And of course, over time, this created friction between the two. Many of his streams were filled with large quantities of alcohol, which Valya seemed to struggle with. When she was sober, she was amicable and calm, but when she drank, she became loud and sometimes even aggressive. Now, this often visibly tested Stas's patience. However, he would put up with it because the more that she acted up, the more viewers came to his stream, and the more she drank, the more that donations would come their way. Although Valya was basically his partner, she was not exempt from the abusive behavior he inflicted on others. And unfortunately, that meant that she became a frequent target of his audience. Their requests would often vary in intensity. However, as time passed by, it was clear that Stas and his audience were becoming increasingly daring towards her. As a result, Stas would physically hit and throw things at her, in one instance even smashing a plate across her head. Other times, she was told to down heavy quantities of alcohol when she was clearly already intoxicated. And in many of these streams, she was often doused in cold water, pelted with eggs, and even hit across the face. In one of the most shocking instances, he even pepper sprayed Valya, after being requested to do it for the equivalent of $1 measly. This was without any warning whatsoever, and Valya, she was visibly and audibly in pain. The very concerning thing about this story so far is that there was almost no limit as to what Stas's audience would ask for, and to make matters even worse, Stas had no respect or boundaries for the people he worked with. It soon became evident that, for a price, Stas would do almost anything to his acquaintances, his friends, and even his partner, no matter how low the donation or how high the request. Now, sometimes his audience would highlight his rather extraordinarily questionable behavior. However, the sadists in his audience would also try to suppress them, and Stas would often laugh it off or merely shrug his shoulders. It became evident through his words, actions, and body language that he truly did not care. Now, one thing worse than terrible behavior is an audience that actively supports and encourages it to perpetuate out of control. Stas was cruel, and his people enabled him. So, how far was Stas Reeflay willing to go for money and views? And if he wasn't prepared to stop, where would he? Well, sadly, the whole of Russia was just about to find out. In the early morning of December 3rd, 2020, Moscow's authorities were alerted to an alarming situation in the small village of Ivanovka. Multiple calls to the authorities had been made throughout the morning, all of which reporting domestic violence at an apartment just outside of town. After a while, calls were made requesting an ambulance be sent to the address. And one of those callers was 30-year-old Stanislav Reshetnyak. Paramedics arrived at the destination just after sunrise, but sadly, the prognosis wasn't good. Behind a red building blanketed in snow, they were met with a distressed Stas and an unresponsive Valya. Stas was incredibly drunk, and Valya, who was lying on the sofa, wasn't moving at all and was cold to the touch. Sadly, paramedics pronounced her dead on arrival. Unfortunately, they had seen this many times before. Stas repeatedly asked them if they were sure that she was dead. Seemingly, he was unable to face the reality that he now found himself in. And in a rather typical Russian fashion, the paramedic sarcastically replied with, "No, now she will wake up and start dancing." Dark humor aside, we know this happened because the entire thing was recorded on Livestream for the whole world to see. In the paramedic's defense, she had no idea she was being recorded. I mean, who in their right mind would be willing to broadcast that sort of thing? And by the way, almost all of those emergency calls were not actually made by Stas himself, but by his worried viewers, many of which believed that he had taken things way too far. So, what exactly happened here? What actions pushed this stupid ticking time bomb over the edge? And how did Valya meet her untimely demise? The night of December the 2nd began like any other. As always, Stas, Valya, and their mutual friend Marina decided to broadcast their evening with a few drinks. Things began as usual, with the group sitting in front of the PC, drinking and chatting. However, as the night progressed, Valya became increasingly irritated. It seemed that tension between her and Stas was progressively worsening. It was clear that she loved him and wanted a relationship with him, but Stas was not keen on the idea, and the presence of another woman, who Stas seemed to get along with very well, seemed to fuel the fire. That is when the two had a public argument on stream. Apparently, Valya hadn't brought enough alcohol for the three of them, and so, as a result, she was told to go to the store and buy some more hard liquor. While Valya was out, it was clear that Stas and Marina sat visibly closer and shared more playful banter. His audience commented on this, and when Valya returned with her bottle in hand, she also realized. As the night progressed and multiple drinks were consumed, Valya complained that the audience had found her escort profile online and started to leave negative reviews, therefore, as a result, causing her to lose several clients. Sadly, things would only get progressively worse. Valya was seen slapping Stas on the arm before he threatened her back by saying, "You touch me again and I will break your face." Understood? Now, in the Western world, we've seen streamers get cancelled for far less. In fact, only 3 or 4 weeks ago, the internet annihilated insecure streamer Yuri after he livestreamed himself whining at his girlfriend. The long story short is that he found out on stream that his girlfriend made a YouTube video with another man years prior, and this was enough for him to criticize her and even question her reliability. Now, whether it was because Stas was a nobody with barely any watchers, or due to a cultural difference in the internet world, he would not face the same level of criticism as Yuri, despite doing far worse. Marina could only watch while things unfolded, and Valya's irritation seemed to grow by the hour. She then started to unplug the streaming camera, which of course infuriated Stas, and it only got worse from here. Stas approached her in the kitchen, where Valya then grabbed a knife to defend herself, and after wrestling the knife off her, she slapped him on the back, to which he responded with a heavy-handed hit to the face. Later on, Marina brought some food for Stas, only for Valya to throw the plate across the room. That is when a viewer donated $1,000 to the stream, asking Stas to beat Valya and then lock her outside of the apartment. Now, Valya very clearly was not okay with this. Freezing conditions aside, she was anxious about being outside of the property. Valya, who was clearly inebriated, fell back into a chair and pulled out a flip knife to defend herself. She then fell from her chair and, judging by the crash that was heard, it was a pretty hard one. And although Stas would go on to help her up, that was only after hitting her twice across the head. After this, Valya was then pushed away, leading her to smash her head across the kitchen table. At this point in time, Marina had become so fed up with all of the bickering that she decided to call a taxi home, leaving the two to deal with their issues alone. And meanwhile, that fighting would continue, being broadcasted for the entire world to see. But not that that really mattered. The more they argued and the more drama that happened, the more viewers that would come in. The problem is, people love a good bit of drama, especially between a drunk couple. As you can probably imagine, Stas is not a man who faces challenges with sensibility. And so, what is a money-hungry boy with an earful going to do in this situation? Of course, he's going to take that money and then throw Valya outside the door. However, that was only after stripping her down to just her underwear, to which Valya really did not want to happen. Not only was this incredibly humiliating, but it also compounded to her danger. The temperature that night was -3 degrees Celsius or 26 Fahrenheit. Valya begged him to stop, but Stas, he simply didn't care. He told her to sober up and get outside. Returning to his stream and the warmth of his apartment, Stas carried on as usual by himself, though outside, he and other viewers could hear Valya calling his name, begging to be let back in. Valya was ignored for 15 grueling minutes in the cold, until his audience finally begged him to let her back inside. But even still, Stas said he would only unlock the door after his stream received 50 more likes, which eventually he received. That is when he finally got up, walked off screen, and dragged Valya back inside. But alarmingly, Valya was no longer responsive, and was now cold to the touch. Stas could be heard saying, "Valya, Valya, damn, you look like you are dead. Bunny, come on. Tell me something, I'm worrying. Damn, I can't feel her heartbeat. Guys, there's no pulse. She's pale and she's not breathing. Now, this situation was where his audience clearly drew the line. Valya was no longer just a joke to the sadistic masses, and she now seemed to be in grave danger. It was at this moment that multiple viewers made calls to Moscow's authorities. After bringing Valya into the main room, Stas carried her to the sofa and then laid her down. He began to panic, realizing the sheer gravity of the situation. Sitting back in his desk chair, he continued to talk to his audience, drink, and listen to music. All in the meanwhile, his friend or girlfriend lay dead beside him. Eventually, as the sun began to rise in the early hours of the morning, he too called emergency services, which, in response, would lead paramedics to visiting his property several minutes later. After Valya was pronounced dead at the scene, Stas was then promptly arrested by the authorities and held by Moscow police for 48 hours while Valya's body was sent for examination. Although most news sources report that Valya died as a result of hypothermia from being shut outside, autopsy reports would later conclude that the cause of her death was cranial trauma. And, as we know, his public stream corroborated this evidence. To summarize the situation here, there were multiple instances when Valya hit her head. Once when she fell off of the chair, a few times when Stas hit her directly, and then again when he pushed her into the kitchen table. The autopsy reported bruising to her face and a soft tissue, which aligned to his own confession of hitting Valya multiple times through the night. And although he initially seemed to be quite remorseful about the situation, that strangely changed overnight. In fact, he soon denied that Valya had died at his hands, and instead claimed that she had suffered a stroke after blacking out. I mean, to me, that sounds like his lawyers told him that what can't be proved can be excused instead. Valya's public death created a story that spread like wildfire across Russia and eventually the world. However, it does seem that every news station has seemed to spin its own narrative. Within court proceedings, Stas straddled on the line of remorse, alternating between depicting Valya as his cherished best friend, praised for her kindness and loyalty, and condemning her as a drug-addicted prostitute. He further asserted that her death was inevitable, regardless of his involvement, and that he was a good guy who merely tried to help her, and that she was furthermore out of control. His family staunchly defended him, with his mother, Elena, even insisting that he was as harmless as a soft little kitten. However, I myself find that quite hard to believe. I mean, just look at all of the evidence made through his very own live streams. In April of 2021, his punishment would finally be served, though it was not what some of you would hope for. Due to the nature of Valya's death, there was no direct evidence attaching Stas to her demise. And while Stas bore no direct intent for Valya's death, the video evidence and coroner's report strongly indicated that she suffered fatal head injuries under his watch. Initially charged with manslaughter, his sentence was eventually mitigated under Russian law, and with the delay between his actions and Valya's passing, he was ultimately convicted of a far lesser offense. Roughly translated into English, Stas was charged with intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm and danger to human life committed through the use of an object which resulted in death by negligence. And so, in April of 2021, Stanislav Reshetnyak went on trial for his so-called negligence towards Valentina Grigorieva. Now, despite facing a maximum penalty of only 15 years, his defense team negotiated a reduced sentence of 6 years in a maximum security prison, a daunting prospect in Russia. The case's widespread media coverage prompted the Russian government to scrutinize the legality of trash streaming, which, until this point in time, was a previously overlooked phenomenon. As a result, a bill has been under deliberation since December of 2023, which aims to penalize anyone who creates an abusive trash stream online. However, to this day, and the date this video is being published, its passage remains uncertain, and domestic violence in Russia is still treated as a misdemeanor rather than a felony. Many people have suffered and still do suffer from this violent and dehumanizing form of entertainment, with Valya being one of those most deeply affected. Despite her life taking a troubled turn, she is remembered as a sweet and kind woman who aspired to be an actress, a stark contrast to the cruel circumstances that she ultimately found herself in. And sadly, the man who has taken decades upon decades of her life away will only spend 6 years of his own behind bars. Hopefully one day Valentina's family will find justice, though if I'm honest, I don't think that's going to happen with this sentence. And on that note, what do you think about this one? Do you think that Stas should have received a harsher punishment? And what do you think about trash streaming? As always, let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, I think that pretty much ends the video today, folks. I'm going to keep this outro nice and short and sweet here, but thank you so much for watching today. I really do appreciate it. My Patreon is here for early access, and also check out my social media, most notably my Instagram. Also, if you want to get some delicious coffee, check out classifiedcoffeeco.com. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you again so much for watching, folks, and as always, I'll see you again very soon for another one. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.